Talk APUSH. We have a new video today. It's the bee's knees by the big cheese himself, Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we jaw over Unit 4, Day 6. But first, let's do our daily punishment. I wasn't originally going to get a brain transplant, but then I changed my mind. Your key terms for today: Andrew Johnson, the Freedmen's Bureau, the 10% Plan, the Wade Davis Bill, Black Codes, the Crop-Lien System, Sharecropping, the Military Reconstruction Act, Seward's Folly, Redeemers, Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, Free Citizen Vote, Scalawags, Carpetbaggers, the Ku Klux Klan, Impeachment, and the Compromise of 1877. We're going to go over Johnson's Reconstruction policy, how he wanted to kind of forgive the South. He was a Democrat and he was a Southerner. He's going to want to forgive the South, which is going to upset a lot of the more radical Republicans. We'll talk about Congressional Reconstruction, how they wanted to punish the South and they wanted to really help out African Americans. We'll talk about Congress versus Johnson. He will be eventually impeached. And we'll talk about Seward's Folly, the end of Reconstruction, lastly, and the Compromise of 1877. So, problems of peace. The rebel leaders will be pardoned by Andrew Johnson after the Civil War eventually. The South is going to face, their economy is going to collapse. The Southern factories were closed. They had runaway inflation. They had no transportation, especially after Sherman's March to the Sea. Johnson was racist. He was a poor white man from Tennessee. He fought for the North because he believed in the Union. He was kind of like Andrew Jackson. He was a Jacksonian Democrat. He's a champion of the poor whites. He was Lincoln's vice president. He wasn't very dignified. He appeared drunk at the inauguration. He actually had a really bad cold and he just kept drinking whiskey to make himself feel better, which is not a good medical way of doing things, guys. At the beginning of Reconstruction, the North will create the Freedmen's Bureau, the Congress will, because after the Civil War, one of the things the South has to accept when the Civil War ends is they have to accept the 13th Amendment, which freed all slaves. Many of the slaves were unskilled, unlettered, with no money or property, or no knowledge to survive. The Freedmen's Bureau will be created by Congress. It was a primitive welfare agency. It provided food, clothing, medical care, and education. You had children, adults, grandparents, and great-grandparents all in the same class learning. White Northerners would come from the North and move to the South to help out former slaves in the Freedmen's Bureau. It's one of the better things the North did. It also is the beginning of public education in the South. During the Civil War, when Lincoln was still alive, there was debate on what Reconstruction would look like. Lincoln did not want to punish the South. He thought they never legally left the Union. He wanted to do something called the 10% Plan. Only as long as 10% of the Southerners took an oath of allegiance, they could join the Union again after they accepted the 13th Amendment. Then they would form new governments. He didn't want to punish them. Congress did not like his plan. Congress will pass the Wade Davis Bill, which said 50% of the Southerners had to take the oath. They really wanted to punish the South more. Lincoln will refuse to sign this. He will be assassinated. Honestly, if Lincoln was still alive, he would have had problems with Congress unless he was willing to be more harsh. So, as far as his reputation goes, Lincoln being assassinated was probably not the worst thing. During this time, there'll be two factions within the Republican Party. The moderates were led by people like Lincoln. They thought the South should be allowed to come back swiftly and simply. Let's not punish them. They weren't as worried about civil rights. The radicals thought the South should atone for its sins. The wealthy planters should be punished. We need to have federal laws that protect former slaves, freemen, and we need to guarantee that they have protection, because otherwise the South will start persecuting them again. When Johnson becomes president, he's going to approve the 10% Plan. He will disenfranchise Southerners with more than $20,000 of property. A lot of these were like the Southern generals and the Southern governmental leaders. He'll say that they have to do a special state convention. They must repeal their order of secession. They must repudiate all Confederate debt, so they're in charge of that themselves. They need to ratify the 13th Amendment. Once they do that, they can join the Union again. This is a pretty lenient policy. A lot of southern states will do this, and the South was super arrogant. They'll do this, but even though when they're doing this, they're afraid of the blacks that are former slaves getting more freedom, so they're going to start to pass black codes or Jim Crow laws. Black codes were meant to designate, to regulate freedmen of former slaves. It ensured that they were stable and subservient. It prevented them from leaving their land they're living on. So even though they are free now, they have to stick with the land and they can't leave it. They have labor contracts. One of the most famous labor contracts is called the Crop-Lien system. Basically, the Crop-Lien system made a lot of the former slaves indentured servants, and they were stuck to the land. This is also sometimes called sharecropping. The slaves were tied to the land and the creditors. Some poor whites were sharecroppers too. So even though the Civil War is over and slavery is quote unquote ended, they're still being mistreated. The black codes also made it illegal for them to buy land. There could be no idleness. If a black did not have a job, they could basically be enslaved again. No interracial marriages, and it made it almost impossible for them to vote. And the South is going to be doing this kind of BS for the next 100 years. These are some examples of black codes, Jim Crow laws. These are literacy tests they did to prevent blacks from voting. And you should just try some of these right here. Like, because these are asinine. These are meant to trip people up. These are meant to be like, things that seem like they're easy answers, but they're not. And they're meant to make them to fail. And the only people that had to do these literacy tests were African Americans. Like, look at this. This is so ridiculous. Oh my God. All right. Here's what's going to happen. After Johnson's 10% plan, former leaders of the Confederacy are going to return to their seats. During the Civil War, the Republicans had passed many laws that favored the North, like the Morrill Tariff, the Pacific Railroad Act. They created a transcontinental railroad, and the Homestead Act. Freedmen had now counted as a whole person. Because of the 13th Amendment, there's no 3/5 compromise anymore. That means the South actually had more votes in Congress. When a lot of the Northern Republicans see that the South is appointing former traitors into Congress, they're going to be furious, and Congress is going to start to take over Reconstruction, and they're going to start to try to punish the South. This is going to lead to a clash with Congress. Congress is going to go against Johnson. Johnson will veto extending the Freedmen's Bureau. He didn't want to help out blacks. Congress is going to pass a civil rights bill. Johnson will veto it. Congress will go over his veto. Congress is going to propose the 13th Amendment, which Johnson did support at first, which will end slavery. After they ended slavery, a lot of southern states will not give blacks the right to vote. So then Congress will pass the 14th Amendment, and the states will ratify it, which made all African Americans, all people, citizens. Johnson was against this, but it still passed in the states. Eventually, the South will try to get around the 14th Amendment, so Congress and the states will pass the 15th Amendment, which gives all men the right to vote. Johnson's 10% plan is going to lead to a lot of racist, pro-Confederacy Southerners taking back power, and they're going to pass some really bad black codes. So Congress is going to create their own plan on how to deal with the South. In the election of 1866, it was really Republicans versus Johnson. Do we want to be nice to the Southerners, which would be like supporting Johnson and the Democrats, or do we really want to be harsh and punish them, which would be the radicals? And the Republicans will dominate this election. So we're going to start to be more harsh towards the South. Some of the leaders of the radical Republicans were Thaddeus Stevens. He was a member of the House of Representatives. He hated the rebellious Southerners. He wanted to keep the Southerners out as long as possible to change Southern life and to protect the blacks. He wanted to use federal power for social and economic changes. Charles Sumner, the guy that was beat by a cane, is going to be the leader of the radicals in the Senate. and he'll labor for black freedom and racial equality, at least at first, although he will turn against Grant. So he'll kind of be a hypocrite. Thaddeus Stevens, when he died, he was buried at a former slave graveyard. That's where he wanted to be buried. Pretty humble guy in some ways. So Congress is going to pass the Military Reconstruction Act. The Military Reconstruction Act is going to divide the South into 5 military districts commanded by a Union general. The South will be required to ratify the 14th Amendment. Basically, all of the South will be ran by a military general. They'll have no free elections or anything. It's going to be military law. Eventually, and this is going to be much more harsh, it's going to allow the North to protect the blacks, and it's going to prevent the South from joining Congress right away. Congress will eventually pass the 15th Amendment, which will give freedmen the right to vote. Martial law will now be legal with the Military Reconstruction Act. Johnson will try to veto it, but Congress will override his veto. The soldiers will remain in the South all the way until 1877. Women will not be allowed to vote. A lot of women supported suffrage movement, and a lot of women were really upset by the 15th Amendment because they thought that since they supported the abolitionist movement, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the Grimke sisters, Sojourner Truth, that also they would support blacks. That the African American abolitionist movement would also support female suffrage, which will not happen for another 50 years. So during radical Reconstruction, black people are going to begin to organize politically, and you're going to have 14 black congressmen and 2 senators. Hiram Revels is the first African-American senators. They're going to serve in state governments. There will be some people that who are Southerners that will actually help out the North. They join the Republican Party. James Longstreet, who was a general for Lee, will actually become a Republican. He was friends with Grant. He's going to be considered the ultimate traitor or scallywag. Some Northerners will move south, and they'll move south to take jobs and to help out freed blacks. The Southerners will hate them. They'll think they're sleazy Northerners, and they'll be called carpetbaggers. The radical Republican legislature did do some really good thing. They'll provide public works, tax reforms, and they'll create the beginning of public education in the South. Here's the Freedmen's Bureau, defending African Americans. Although this is trying to make them, this is kind of a little bit too neutral. This is trying to, like, here's the white racist Southerners and the blacks. It's making the blacks look aggressive also. For the most part, the blacks are like, my God, don't kill us. But, you know. Here's a propaganda cartoon of Johnson. He's betraying the blacks, the African Americans that fought in the Civil War. It's making him out to be a clown. During this time, even though the South had the Military Reconstruction Act, they're going to start to use terrorism to try to get their way. They're going to create a secret organization called the Ku Klux Klan. They're going to wear white outfits. They kind of like wear a white dress with a hood on it. It's meant to intimidate freedmen. They're going to do terror. They're going to kill and lynch black people that want to vote. In 2 days, they kill or wound 200 people in the 1870s. The first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan will be Nathan Bedford Forrest. They're going to use a lot of terror, and it's going to undermine attempts to empower freedmen and to get them to vote. Southern states will start to create bogus literacy laws, which I showed you some examples of those before. Here's an anti-Ku Klux Klan cartoon right here. Here's a Ku Klux Klan rally. You see they're wearing the white dress and they're wearing a white hood. And originally, the burning of the cross was a symbol that was from Scotland. From Scotland, a person would burn a cross and stick it in the ground to show that they're willing to fight they're willing to fight to the death, and their children will fight to the death to protect their homeland. So it's actually a really cool symbol. But of course, the Ku Klux Klan has completely bastardized the symbol and destroyed its meaning. And just like the swastika was originally a symbol of Jainism in India, which was a symbol of peace, it's just like it's been completely taken over by racism. So, yeah, bad times. A lot of places in some areas will have, like, especially in the South, will have like ties to the Ku Klux Klan. So what's going to happen is eventually Congress is going to get tired of Andrew Johnson and they're going to impeach him. So here's what happens. Congress is going to pass something called the Tenure of Office Act, which says that if Johnson wants to get rid of any of his cabinet members, and he was using a lot of Lincoln's old cabinet members, he would need to get congressional approval. Johnson vetoes this. Congress will override it. Honestly, the Tenure of Office Act was super unconstitutional. Congress was just trying to find a way to get rid of Johnson because Johnson was refusing to support radical Reconstruction. He was not doing anything about like the lynchings in the South. So they just want to get rid of him. So he's going to fire, Johnson will fire the Secretary of War, Stanton. He thought he was a radical spy, which he was. Then the Congress will try to impeach Johnson. He'll be convicted in the House, and then he'll be tried for impeachment in the Senate. He needs 2/3 majority. The Republicans had the vote, but some Republican senators will vote against impeachment. They didn't think that Johnson did enough wrong to justify it. And he'll be found not guilty by one vote. They were one vote away from the 2/3 majority. But afterwards, Johnson is pretty much powerless, and he's going to leave the presidency by 1869. And the person that's going to really do most of Reconstruction for the next 8 years will be Ulysses S. Grant, who we'll talk more about next unit. But Grant supported African American equal rights. Here's a cartoon about impeachment. Last thing, guys. Johnson's Secretary of State was William Seward. He was the same one under Lincoln. Seward was originally a very radical Republican, but he's going to become more moderate, and he'll actually support Johnson. The one good thing that Seward does is he is going to spend $7 million and buy Alaska from Russia. At the time, people thought there was no reason for this. They call it Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox, because what is there in Alaska? Freaking ice. But over time, we will see the value of Alaska. All right, so let's finish this up right here. In 1877, Grant is going to end the presidency. Grant is going to end after serving 2 terms. The new Republican is going to be Rutherford B. Hayes. He's going to go against the Democrat, Samuel Tilden. In the election of 1876, it'll be in dispute. There'll be contested votes in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. These 3 states will send winners that says the Democrats and the Republicans win. They'll send contested elections. The House will create a committee to determine who won the election. They'll have 6 Republicans and 5 Democrats in the committee. They'll vote along party lines, and Hayes will be declared the victor. Honestly, Tilden probably did. Okay, so Tilden probably won the election, but also at the same time, the South was basically like using terrorism to prevent blacks from voting. So, IDK. In order to prevent the South from rebelling again, Hayes will say, look, if you let me win this election, I'll agree to pull out my remaining troops, and you can do whatever you want with the blacks. So Hayes is going to make a deal with the devil. This is called the Compromise of 1877. The North will pull out their remaining soldiers. The South is going to really have a free hand to do what they want towards the blacks. The Southerners that had opposed Reconstruction from the very beginning, they were called the Redeemers. They were the extreme states' rights Democrats. They were the racist Democrats. They were the ones that wanted to make life as similar to slavery as possible. The Redeemers will take over government again. And honestly, it's going to be a really bad time if you're black for the next, at least the next 80, 90 years until the Civil Rights Movement. And here's a political cartoon over the Compromise of 1877. All right, guys. So we ended on a sad note. Reconstruction had a lot of good ideas. It had a good vision. It did offer a lot of short-term benefits for freedmen, but ultimately it will not be successful, and ultimately African Americans will not be given equal rights. It's going to take us another 100 years, at least. And even today, they still don't have equal rights. Just look at what's going on. So we are ending the unit right now. We'll be moving on to the Gilded Age next. So we are done with the unit. That was Civil War, causes of Civil War, and Reconstruction. We are done for today, kiddos. Until next time. Deuces. Deuces, yeah.